They called it the London Whale. You might remember, you might have read about it, you might have heard about it on the news, but in May of 2012, how the chairman and CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase Bank announced that a trading unit in London, dubbed the London Whale, had lost a staggering $6 billion in trading on so-called derivative credit default swaps. I have absolutely no idea what a derivative credit default swap is, but I'm sure that Don Young, who I notice isn't here with us this morning, so he has a week to prepare, Don will be able to prep you on that over a coffee fellowship next week, so Janet can give him the heads up. But whatever derivative credit default swaps are, they're risky. And this trading group in London got trading these vehicles in larger and larger numbers, and they started to mount larger and larger losses, so that they had to begin to fudge their records to hide the scale of the losses they were doing. And then they doubled down and made even bigger bets. So they had to fudge their records even more. They were cooking their books. This past Thursday, J.P. Morgan Chase agreed to a $920 million settlement with the U.S. and U.K. financial regulators. There have been other financial manipulations in recent years. Bernie Madoff with his pyramid scheme, the entire subprime mortgage debacle, the Enron collapse. But before all of that, there was the manager in the 16th chapter of Luke. He was going to lose his job because his master had found out that he was squandering property. Squandering. It's an interesting word choice because in the previous chapter of Luke, Luke 15, you'll remember that's where we have the parable of the prodigal son who squandered all of his resources. So this manager is facing unemployment, and he needed a plan because he couldn't dig and he had no intention of begging. So he hatched a scheme, and he called his master's creditors in, and he cooked the books. For the man who owed 100 jugs of oil, he said, quickly, market 50. For the one who owed 100 containers of wheat, let's just call it 80. The plan was when the manager was out on the street, when he was without any income, when he was in risk of homelessness, these creditors would remember the turn that he gave them and take care of him. It was sneaky. It was presumably illegal. It was some real wheeling and dealing. But we're surprised, aren't we, by a couple things that come out of this parable. First, the master finds out about the manager's accounting manipulations, but instead of turning him into the Galilee Securities and Exchange Commission, he commends the manager. And in Luke's words says, because he had acted shrewdly. But then there's our greater surprise, because Jesus seems to suggest that we too ought to emulate this shadowy figure and do some wheeling and dealing ourselves. For the children of this age, the folks in the real world, they mean, are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light, believers. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. It's a bit awkward, isn't it? A bit unsettling for Jesus to be suggesting that we follow this role model who is a cheat. Some commentators have tried to make some further sense out of the passage, make it a little more understandable, actually kind of help us get a sense of the motivations that would make this a little more comfortable for us. Here's option one. The manager, in reducing the amount of the creditors, was just deducting the interest that his master, the rich man, was charging all these folks. And it's clever because Deuteronomy 23 forbids the levying of any interest in financial deals. And so the manager, according to this approach, actually is acting, bless you, is acting out of virtue. And so it makes sense, doesn't it, that now the master says, oh, and he commends the manager because he sees how shrewd he's been, because the owner can't now go about and publicly try to reinstate these illegal interest payments that have been publicly waived to be bad for his reputation in business. Or there's option two, that explains things by concluding that the amount that the manager is reducing, what people owe his master, that amount is equal to the amount that he was skimming off anyway for himself. So that's quite shrewd then, because the manager is giving up his regular short-term take to guarantee a longer-term return. So those two options are interesting, but I don't think they can get around what sticks out in verse 8. His master commended the dishonest manager. I believe the simplest route, the most direct route, is most likely the truest route. The manager was a cheat. He was taking down the profits of his master to save his skin. And his master, perhaps not a necessarily scrupulous person himself, upon coming upon this device, upon this scheme, couldn't but help to say, well, you know, got to hand it to you. That was pretty smart. So that's fine. That's the master. But what do we do with the master, capital M? What do we do with Jesus' message? Maybe Jesus is just calling us to be shrewd with whatever resources we have. Maybe he's saying to us, you know, we all have resources to us, but are we being as creative as we can with the resources that we have? If we have limited resources as an individual or as a family or as a committee or as a church, are we being as nimble? Are we being as decisive as we could be? Are we as God's people using the resources that we have as skillfully, as adeptly as we could to further the kingdom of God? And as the last verse lifts up, are we sure that we're not confusing our resources, our wealth, whatever material gifts that we have? Are we sure that we're not valuing them more than we're valuing God? Because we can't serve two masters. We can't serve both wealth and God. This parable is joined with the passage from 1 Timothy in the lectionary that we have. And there are loads of preaching angles for this passage of 1 Timothy. But given our study of Luke 16, there is only one that I'm interested in. And it represents perhaps the greatest wheeling and dealing of them all. For there is one God, there's also one mediator between God and humankind, Christ Jesus, himself human, who gave himself a ransom for all. This was attested at the right time. For this I was appointed a herald, an apostle. I'm telling the truth, I'm not lying. Paul describes Jesus as giving himself as a ransom for all, for everybody. It's a powerful image of the saving work of Christ. Because what do we need when we're in a situation of needing a ransom? When we're caught, when we're trapped, when we're imprisoned, and most importantly, when we know we can't do a doggone thing to help ourselves or to get ourselves out of a situation, a bad situation, a life-threatening situation. In any ransom scenario, you need two things. On one hand, you need that hostage-like situation. And on the other hand, you need someone who, A, has resources, and B, has the motivation to use those resources to save you. In putting together a ransom, we picture a person, don't we, filling a suitcase with cash. They need to scramble to get all the money that they can. They pull strings, they call in favors, they do absolutely whatever they need to raise the needed money. They wheel and they deal to meet the ransom demand. And in the case of you and me, God did not offer any silver or gold. In the case of you and me and the rest of humanity, which is trapped in the sins of our own making and the sins of the world, God sent something far more precious. He sent his Son to the cross. And because of that, we are free. God didn't take our accounts, our debts, and say, you owe me 100, make it 50. You owe me 100, make it 80. God said, I have wiped your debts clear, clean, zero. You are forgiven. You are a new creation. When Jesus said to the paralytic, take your mat, pick it up and walk, that was a divine ransom payment. When Jesus said, come unto me, all ye who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest, that was a divine ransom payment. When Jesus said, whoever is without sin should cast the first stone, and then turned to the woman and said, has no one condemned you? Then neither do I condemn you. Go and do not sin again. That was a divine ransom payment. And when Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life, those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me, they will never die. That was a divine ransom payment. Because of what God did through Christ on the cross. And 3 days later, we are free to live life and to live it abundantly. How does it affect your life knowing that you have been freed by this ransom payment? By the fact that someone else gave themselves for you as a ransom. When we realize that we are a redeemed and a forgiven people, how does it affect your life? What gratitude do we feel? What newfound loyalty and devotion do we discover? How does being ransomed ourselves affect how we treat other people? How does it affect how we treat other people that we can see are trapped in a hell of their own making or somebody else's making? How does it affect how we treat other people that we know go through life running about doing everything in their life without knowing Jesus Christ? Without having a relationship to God? How do we interact with someone that we can see they're looking for someone, anyone, to give them a lifeline, which could take the form of our saying to them, "Would you want to go to church with me next Sunday?" How does being ransomed affect our prayer life? How often does the fact that someone has ransomed you, how often does that lead us to go to prayer? And then what does it suggest that we say to God when we are in prayer? How does being ransomed affect our commitment to reading the Bible? If the one who saved us, if that story is in the scriptures that we've been given, don't we want to immerse ourselves in that story every single day? And don't we want to make sure that our children and our grandchildren know that story? How does being ransomed affect how we use the resources that God has graced us with, the resources of our time and of our energy and of our money? Dr. William B. McLean is the professor of preaching and worship at Wesley Theological Seminary, and he gave a sermon in which he told about how he traveled to South Korea, to a small town. And there he met a man by the name of Smitty Lee. And so Dr. McLean asked him whether the name Smitty was Korean. And the tailor told him of how during the Korean War, an American soldier from Virginia had saved his life. And that American soldier's name was Smitty, and this is just a coincidence, Smitty Ransom. But the tailor told Dr. McLean about the tradition in Asian culture that he summed up, the tailor did, he summed up this tradition in 2 sentences. He saved my life, I took his name. Fellow Christians, we are saved. We are redeemed. We are free. Thanks be to God through the gift of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.